Commander Rylan Cole sat in the dimly lit corner of the dusty bar, a place far from the once grand battleships and missions he'd led in the past. His hand trembled slightly as it wrapped around the glass of aged liquor in front of him, but his mind wasn't on the drink. His eyes were fixed on the flickering holoscreen embedded in the bar's wall, showing images of the latest disaster to rock the galaxy. The Korra war machine. The Korra, a ruthless alien empire, had swept across several star systems with terrifying speed, destroying colonies, obliterating fleets, and slaughtering countless innocents. Earth's forces, though once formidable, had been defeated in a series of brutal confrontations, leading to a reluctant retreat. Now, humanity's warships were scattered, and its influence was barely a whisper across the stars. Rylan had been there at the front lines, a hero lauded for his successes in the early days of the war. But after the crushing loss of the Siege of Terrell, everything changed. Rylan had returned home to Earth, disillusioned, broken. He'd left the military, wanting nothing more than to fade into obscurity, to find solace in anonymity. Yet even here, on a far-flung planet like Chorus 7, he couldn't escape the weight of his past. As the holoscreen cut to a live transmission from the Galactic Council, a sudden familiar voice crackled through the air, pulling Rylan from his thoughts. "Commander Cole, we need you." It was the voice of Admiral Celine Darius, a woman Rylan once admired deeply, before her own ideals had been shattered by the war's horrors. Her message, broadcast through encrypted frequencies, carried the unmistakable urgency that Rylan had once felt, the call to fight against the impossible odds. He felt a sinking sensation in his chest, but he fought to suppress it. "The Korra are advancing on Trelgur," Admiral Darius continued, her tone grim. "The planet is unprepared, and we believe they're targeting the Trelgorian core. If we don't act now, the entire planet could be destroyed. The Council has made a decision, Commander. We need you to lead the defense." Rylan's grip tightened around the glass as he exhaled sharply. The Trelgorians, an isolated and stubborn people, had never wanted humanity's help. They had treated Earth's forces with contempt during the early days of the war. Rylan knew firsthand how deep the hatred ran, and yet the Council was asking him to risk everything to defend a world that had shown nothing but disdain for his kind. He had heard the whispers of rebellion within Trelgur's cities, factions that preferred their harsh, self-imposed independence to any form of unity with other worlds. For them, Earth was a symbol of everything wrong with the galaxy. And now, they were facing extinction at the hands of an enemy they refused to trust. His hand hovered over the console, fingers twitching as if trying to decide if he should accept the call. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to refuse. He had been there before, fought for causes that hadn't been his own, given everything for worlds that didn't appreciate it. Yet, as the message continued, one word kept echoing in his mind: unprepared. They were unprepared. Rylan closed his eyes, trying to drown out the voice in his head. He was tired, too tired to fight for others again, especially for those who had always seen humanity as a burden. But deep down, he knew the truth. If not him, then who? The Korra were merciless, and the Trelgorians were too proud to ask for help. A low sigh escaped his lips as he activated the console. "Admiral Darius, I'll take the mission. But make no mistake, this is not a rescue. It's a chance to prove something." The response was swift, her voice tinged with a note of relief. "Understood, Commander. We'll send your orders immediately. The fleet is ready when you are." As the transmission ended, Rylan stared at the now empty screen. He wasn't a hero anymore. He was just a man, burdened with the responsibility he couldn't refuse. A reluctant soldier, once again asked to stand for something that might never truly be worth it. But in his gut, he knew, for Trelgur's sake, he had no choice but to fight. Rylan's shuttle descended through the thick atmosphere of Trelgur, the view of its rugged, decaying surface flashing below. The planet was a war-torn husk, its cities scarred by years of infighting and neglect. Vast stretches of once vibrant fields were now barren wastelands, scared by artillery strikes and battles long since forgotten. The Trilgorians had fought relentlessly for their independence, yet they had no resources left to rebuild. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of their collective struggle. The shuttle touched down with a soft thud, its landing gear sinking slightly into the cracked earth. The ramp lowered, and Ryland stepped out, surveying the area. His boots crunched against the gravel as he surveyed the crumbling landscape. This wasn't the planet he had imagined. It was a world on the brink of collapse, not just from the Korra, but from its own internal divisions. "Commander Cole, welcome to Trelgur," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to face the speaker, a tall, broad-shouldered Trelgorian named Varric, one of the few leaders who had reluctantly agreed to meet with him. Varric wore the weathered, battle-worn armor of a seasoned warrior, his face hard and unyielding. Beside him stood a few of his officers, their eyes wary but curious, as if Ryland's arrival had been both anticipated and feared. "Glad to see you're still in one piece," Ryland muttered, his voice low and guarded. "We didn't expect you to show up at all," Varric replied, his tone flat but not unfriendly. "We thought you humans would leave us to our fate like everyone else." Ryland ignored the jab, focusing on the task at hand. "The Korra are coming, Varric. If we don't work together, we'll all be dead before the end of the month." Varric's eyes narrowed, and the rest of his officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. There was no love lost between them and humanity, but Ryland didn't have time to argue about the past. The Korra were coming, and the Trelgorians needed to wake up to the threat. "Let's get to the planning table," Ryland said, nodding toward the nearby command building. "We need to act fast." Inside the command center, the air was thick with tension. Holographic maps of Trelgur flickered across the walls, showing key strategic. He knew that in this war, trust wasn't something that could be given, it had to be earned. And this time, he wasn't sure if he could. But one thing was certain: Trelgur's survival rested on the fragile thread of that tenuous alliance. The Korra were coming, and if they didn't unite, they would all fall. The days following Ryland's arrival on Trelgur were a blur of strategy meetings, desperate negotiations, and mounting tension. Despite the grumbling and mistrust that permeated the air, the reality of the Korra threat forced the factions to reluctantly agree on a temporary alliance. There was little love among them, but survival was a stronger motivator than pride. Ryland stood at the command center, watching as the Trelgorian forces slowly organized, bolstered by the limited but vital resources humanity had managed to bring with them. Crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and tactical equipment were unloaded under the watchful eyes of Trelgorian soldiers who barely acknowledged their human counterparts. But at least they were working together, albeit grudgingly. It was a start. Varric, though still cautious, had become an unexpected ally. The Trelgorian leader's commanding presence was unyielding, yet Ryland could see the weariness in his eyes. Every battle had taken its toll. And now, with the Korra closing in, Trelgur's fate hung by a thread. The war room was filled with static and low murmurings as maps and tactical models glowed around them. Ryland took his place at the table, his gaze fixed on the data. According to their latest reconnaissance reports, the Korra were massing in the Kelra system, just 2 days away. If they pushed forward with their current strategy, they would hit Trelgur within the next 24 hours. "There's no time left," Varric muttered, his brow furrowed. "We need to hit them before they arrive. Our fortifications on the eastern coast are as ready as they'll ever be, but we need to prepare for ground combat too." Ryland nodded. "I've already allocated the fleet to provide support, but they'll need a solid landing zone. I'll take care of the defenses near the coast. What do your forces have in terms of anti-aircraft weapons?" Varric's expression darkened, the lines of frustration and exhaustion evident. "We have outdated systems, nothing capable of dealing with Korra tech. Their ships are faster and more powerful than anything we have." Ryland's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll have to fight smarter, not harder. We can't go toe-to-toe with them head-on, but we can set traps. He turned to the holographic map, pinpointing key locations along the coast. I'll send small, agile strike teams to plant EMP devices along their expected approach routes. It won't disable their fleet completely, but it should disrupt their systems long enough for us to get in and launch a proper counterattack. Varric raised an eyebrow. You plan on relying on sabotage to defeat an enemy that's already destroyed your strongest fleets. We're not facing them with our fleets, Rylan replied, his tone cold but resolute. We're facing them with tactics, ingenuity, and whatever's left of your forces. We don't need to beat them. We just need to slow them down long enough to make them rethink their strategy. The Trollgorian leaders around the table exchanged skeptical glances, but Rylan could see that a few of them were warming to the idea. The fight against the Korra had always been about overwhelming force, but that was a tactic Trelgor could no longer afford. If they were going to survive, they had to think beyond brute strength. I'll need your best engineers to help design the traps, Rylan continued. We can't rely on your outdated tech. We'll need to upgrade it. This has to be a guerrilla war, or it'll be over before it starts. Very well, Varric said, his voice steady, though there was still an edge to it. But know this, Commander Cole, we Trollgorians don't fight for your people. We fight for our own. Rylan met his gaze with a hard look of his own. I never asked you to. The plan was set into motion swiftly, with Rylan coordinating with his human fleet to assist in gathering the necessary equipment. The Trollgorians had their own engineers working frantically to modify their defenses, while small teams of soldiers were dispatched to key locations to begin setting the traps. The atmosphere around the camp was a mixture of exhaustion and determination, each soldier knowing that their survival depended on a razor-thin edge of uncertainty. As night fell, Rylan stood outside the command center, staring at the stars. The sky was clearer here than it had been on Earth, but it felt no less lonely. The gravity of his decision to fight for Trelgor weighed heavily on him, yet he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had come here out of duty, but the more he worked alongside the Trollgorians, the more he realized that this wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, for both him and them. He could see the cracks in the Trollgorian resolve, but also the fire still burning deep within them. A fire that, if properly stoked, might turn the tide of this war. The Korra were coming, and time was no longer on their side. But as Rylan turned back to the command center, he felt a strange sense of determination rising within him. For once, the odds didn't seem so insurmountable. Let's show them what we're made of, he muttered to himself, before heading inside to finalize the strategy. The first wave of traps was set. Rylan stood atop a small ridge overlooking the eastern coast of Trelgor, the early morning light casting long shadows over the desolate terrain. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he surveyed the scene. In the distance, he could make out the faint outline of the Korra fleet. They were closing in. Varric, who had accompanied him, stood silently beside him, his expression unreadable. The Trollgorian leader's eyes flicked over the map in his hand, though Rylan could tell his mind was elsewhere, likely on his people and the approaching storm. They won't expect this, Varric said, his voice low, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. No, they won't, Rylan agreed. He turned to face the Trollgorian leader. This isn't going to be a one and done, though. We need to keep the pressure on them. Hit them hard, then disappear. Varric's lips curled into a grim smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. We've always fought in the shadows. This is what we do best. Rylan nodded. The Trollgorians had a unique style of warfare, hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla assaults, and ambushes. It was all they could afford now, given the state of their military and their fractured society. It wouldn't be enough to defeat the Korra outright, but it would buy them time. Time to regroup, time to figure out a better way to fight. As they watched, the first ships in the Korra fleet emerged from the atmosphere, their massive forms blocking out the sun. The alien invaders had arrived. Ryland's fingers drummed lightly against his sidearm as he took in the sight. The Korra ships were a monstrous sight, sleek, silver-black hulls covered in alien runes that glowed faintly, their weapons bristling with deadly energy. They were a terrifying sight, but Ryland knew they weren't invincible. The strike teams had already taken their positions. Across the eastern coastline, small squads of Trelgorian and human soldiers had concealed themselves, their weapons at the ready, prepared to disrupt the Korra's advance. Ryland turned to his comms officer, a young Trelgorian woman named Lyra. "Status. Everything is in place, Commander," Lyra replied, her fingers flying over the controls. "The EMP devices are primed, and the automated artillery is ready for the signal." Ryland glanced back at the fleet. The Korra ships were getting closer. Too close. "Activate the traps," he said, his voice steady but urgent. A series of explosions echoed in the distance, one after another, as the EMP devices triggered. The sky lit up with flashes of light, as Korra vessels began to twitch and slow. Their systems were momentarily overloaded, their energy shields flickering, their weapons misfiring. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Korra fleet responded quickly, reconfiguring their systems as the EMP pulses faded, but it was enough. Ryland's forces had gained the upper hand, if only for a few moments. "Now," Ryland barked, his voice carrying across the ridge. The Trelgorian and human forces sprang into action, launching their assault on the disoriented Korra ships. Artillery fire from hidden positions peppered the Korra fleet, forcing the invaders to veer off course and scramble to defend themselves. Small strike teams emerged from the shadows, using the terrain to their advantage as they sabotaged key enemy vessels. Ryland moved swiftly through the battlefield, his pulse racing with adrenaline. He could hear the roar of artillery fire and the distant crackle of energy blasts, but he remained focused. There were no guarantees in this war, no assurances that the Korra would falter or retreat. But for now, they were off balance, and that was all Ryland needed. "We've got a breach in the perimeter," shouted one of his officers, breaking through the chaos. "Korra reinforcements are coming in hot." Ryland's heart skipped a beat as he glanced toward the incoming ships. The Korra were regrouping faster than expected. Their ships were adjusting their trajectory, moving in unison, preparing to strike back with overwhelming force. "Fall back to secondary positions," Ryland shouted. "Regroup and cover the retreat." The strike teams withdrew quickly, vanishing into the rugged terrain, taking their wounded with them. The Korra, still disoriented but recovering, pushed forward in relentless pursuit. As the first wave of Korra ships closed in, Ryland and his team withdrew to a secondary position further inland. The fight wasn't over, but it was a battle won. For now. Varric, now alongside Ryland again, looked toward the horizon with a mixture of satisfaction and grim resolve. "That was only the beginning. We can't afford to let up now." Ryland nodded. "The Korra will be back, but they'll know they've been hit, and that's more than we could have hoped for." The battle had only just begun, but for the first time, Ryland allowed himself a brief, fleeting moment of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push them all forward. The aftermath of the first strike was a fragile victory. The Korra had been momentarily stunned, their fleet scattered and disoriented by the carefully timed EMP traps. But Ryland knew better than to assume they would stay off balance for long. The Korra were relentless, and their adaptability was unmatched. The real challenge was yet to come. Back at the command center, the mood was somber despite the success of the first attack. Ryland leaned over the tactical map, his fingers tracing the positions of the Korra fleet. Their ships were no longer in disarray. They had recovered quickly, reorganizing into a more formidable formation. The fleet had been delayed, but not defeated. "They'll strike again," Ryland muttered to himself, his voice low. "And they'll come harder." Varric, standing across from him, met his gaze. "Yes, the Korra will take this as an insult. They will retaliate with everything they have." Rylan exhaled sharply. Then we need to be ready. We've bought ourselves some time, but it won't last long. Our forces are spread thin. We need more intel on their movements, and we need a plan for when they hit again. Lyra, who had been at the comms console, suddenly straightened. Commander, we've intercepted a Korra transmission. It's encrypted, but we've managed to decrypt part of it. They're moving towards the northern continent. It's their main staging ground. Ryland's heart raced as he processed the information. What are they planning? They're preparing for a full-scale invasion. Lyra confirmed, her voice tense. They're sending in ground forces, massive amounts of troops, heavy artillery, and they're bringing in reinforcements from nearby systems. Ryland cursed under his breath. The Korra weren't just sending their fleet. This would be an all-out assault. They planned to overwhelm Trelgar's defenses completely, to wipe them out in one brutal push. We can't let them land. Not like this, Ryland said, his mind racing as he formulated a plan. Do you have a solution? Varric asked, his tone more urgent now. Ryland turned to face the Trelgorian leader, his mind already spinning with possibilities. We'll need to hit them before they land. We can't wait for them to get entrenched. We'll need air support, ground teams, and all of our remaining resources. The only chance we have is to disrupt their landing zones. Lyra's fingers flew over the console, pulling up detailed terrain maps of the northern continent. We've got limited intel on their drop zones, but there are 3 main landing points. The first is the Fasher Ridge, a narrow pass that leads directly into the heart of the continent. If they control it, they'll have access to the rest of the planet's resources. Ryland nodded grimly. We can't let them secure that pass. If they do, it'll be a bloodbath. We'll need to make our move quickly, Varric said, his expression steely. Once they land, it'll be difficult to dislodge them. I know, Ryland replied. That's why we hit them fast and hard. We'll use our fleet to hit their ships in orbit, take out their landing crafts before they can deploy. Then our ground teams will take over the ridges. We'll need explosives, traps, anything to slow them down. Varric leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. It's a risk, a small window of opportunity. If we fail, Trelgar falls, Ryland finished for him. We all know what's at stake. A tense silence settled over the room. Every member of the command team understood the gravity of the situation. This would be their last chance to stop the Korra invasion before it reached critical mass. There would be no retreat, no fallback position. It was all or nothing. After a moment, Varric broke the silence. You have our support, Commander. We will fight with you, and we will win. Ryland's gaze hardened, his resolve cemented. Then we move out at dawn. This is our moment. If we can stop them now, we may have a chance to turn the tide. If not, he let the sentence hang, knowing the weight of their situation. As the plans were drawn up and the forces mobilized, Ryland found himself once again at the forefront of a battle he hadn't wanted to fight. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked for the weight of an entire planet's survival to rest on his shoulders. But it was his burden now, and he would carry it. The hours leading up to the battle passed in a blur of preparation. Soldiers readied their gear, weapons were checked, and the final strategies were put in place. Ryland walked among the soldiers, offering brief words of encouragement. They were fighting not just for Trelgar, but for their own survival. They had to win. There was no other option. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the landscape, Ryland stood alone on a high ridge, looking out at the horizon where the Korra were coming. They had made their move. Now it was time to see if they could stop it. Dawn broke over the northern continent, its pale light creeping across the land, illuminating the rugged ridges and jagged cliffs that lined the Fasher Pass. Ryland stood at the helm of the Trelgorian flagship, the Torrens Fury, as it sailed through the skies above the continent. The hum of the ship's engines reverberated in the air, and the crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the assault ahead. The battle was imminent. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Below, the landscape stretched out like a canvas of conflict. Traps, explosives, and hidden bunkers dotted the ridges. It was their only hope. If the Korra successfully landed in the Fashar Pass, the Trelgorian forces would be overwhelmed within days. The ground teams were already in position, ready to strike as soon as the Korra made their move. But Rylan wasn't watching the ground. His gaze remained fixed on the sky, where the Korra fleet hummed like a gathering storm. Their warships, dark and imposing, blocked out the sun as they descended in a deadly arc toward the planet's surface. It was a show of force, a statement that nothing would stand between them and their victory. All units in position, Commander. Lyra's voice crackled through the comms, sharp and clear. We're ready to engage on your mark. Rylan gripped the command console, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at Varric, who stood beside him, his face a mask of determination. It's now or never, Rylan said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. Indeed, Varric replied, his tone resolute. Let's make it count. The Trelgorian fleet moved into position, coordinated and precise. Hidden artillery began firing from the cliffs, taking down the first wave of Korra landing crafts. Explosions rocked the sky as the Trelgorian forces launched their counterattack, sending shockwaves through the Korra's fleet. It was a chaotic scramble as the invaders tried to regain control, their ships evasive but slow to react. Target their primary landing craft, Rylan commanded. Don't give them a foothold. The flagship's weapons powered up, and a volley of energy blasts tore through the sky, targeting the heart of the Korra assault. The first wave of enemy dropships exploded into fireballs, their wreckage raining down to the ground below. The ground teams quickly moved in, launching guerrilla-style strikes on the disarrayed Korra forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tide might turn in their favor. But Rylan knew better than to hope for too long. Enemy reinforcements incoming. Lyra's voice was filled with urgency. More Korra ships are emerging from hyperspace. Rylan's blood ran cold as dozens of new Korra warships appeared, their sleek forms cutting through the atmosphere with terrifying speed. The first wave had been only a diversion. Now, the true invasion force was upon them. Brace for impact, Rylan shouted. The sky erupted in chaos as the Korra ships unleashed hell. Their weapons were massive, their energy beams powerful enough to slice through Trelgorian defenses like a hot knife through butter. The torrent's fury rocked under the assault, alarms blaring throughout the ship. Rylan gritted his teeth, refusing to let the fear show on his face. Countermeasures now, he barked. The ship's automated systems sprang to life, firing countermeasures and evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft cannons erupted from the ship's flanks, firing back at the Korra ships with all the fury they could muster. The massive fleet overhead responded in kind, unleashing a hail of destructive energy that tore through the sky, forcing Trelgorian forces to scatter. From the surface, Rylan could hear the sound of battle intensifying. Explosions shook the ground, and the sky above was filled with the frantic dance of weapons fire. Ground teams were engaging with the Korra foot soldiers, using every bit of their training to hold their position. But it was a losing battle. For every Korra they brought down, two more seemed to take their place. Focus fire on the command ship, Rylan ordered, his voice sharp. He wasn't just trying to disable the invaders' ships. He was aiming for their leadership. If he could take out their command vessel, it might throw the Korra into disarray. Lyra and the gunnery team complied immediately, their fire lancing toward the heart of the enemy formation. The Korra flagship, a monstrous vessel covered in jagged alien runes, returned fire with devastating force. A direct hit struck the Tauren's fury, sending a shockwave through the ship. Rylan was thrown to the ground, his head spinning, but he quickly pushed himself back up. "Report," he demanded. "We've sustained heavy damage," Lyra replied through gritted teeth. "Shields are down to 30%. Internal fires in sections 4 and 5. We're holding together for now." The ship groaned under the strain, but Rylan refused to show weakness. He gripped the edge of the console, staring at the battlefield below. The Trollgorian forces were outnumbered and outgunned. The Korra were pressing forward relentlessly, and for every victory the Trollgorians won, the enemy adapted faster. "Prepare for Phase 2, Rylan ordered. "We're not giving up this ground. Not now. Not ever." With that, the fight raged on, each side locked in a desperate struggle for survival, knowing that this would decide the fate of the planet. The battle had reached its peak, and the sky above the northern continent was an inferno. Trollgorian warships fought valiantly against the Korra invaders, their weapons blazing in an unrelenting fury, but the enemy's overwhelming numbers and sheer firepower were beginning to take their toll. The Torrent's fury shuddered under another barrage of energy blasts, sending tremors through the ship's hull. Rylan gripped the command console tightly, his knuckles white. Every instinct told him to retreat, to pull back and save the remaining forces, but that was not an option. He had already made that decision long before the first shot was fired. This was not just about saving Trelgor anymore. It was about sending a message to the Korra, to all the galaxy. Humanity would not yield. Even when faced with insurmountable odds, they would fight until the very last breath. "Enemy flagship is in range." Lyra's voice came through, steady yet tinged with urgency. "We can take it out with another direct hit." Rylan looked at the view screen, where the Korra flagship loomed large in the distance, its dark form dominating the sky. The ship was surrounded by smaller vessels, providing heavy protection. But Rylan had learned long ago that the heart of a beast could always be reached through the cracks in its armor. "Target the core engines," Rylan ordered. "If we disable those, the rest will fall into disarray." The ship's gunnery systems whirred into action as they focused fire on the Korra flagship's vulnerable engine ports. The Torrent's fury fired again and again, each blast ripping into the alien warship's exterior, causing sparks and explosions to ripple across its hull. The flagship's shields flickered under the assault, but they were resilient, refusing to buckle under the pressure. "Shields at 10%. Lyra called out, "We can't take much more." The walls of the bridge groaned under the strain, and the crew members were beginning to look weary, their faces etched with exhaustion. Despite their best efforts, the Korra were adapting too quickly. New reinforcements were pouring in, pushing the Trollgorian forces back on every front. "Not yet," Rylan muttered, his jaw clenched. "We're not done." Suddenly, a violent explosion rattled the ship, and the main engine core shuddered, sending the ship veering to one side. Rylan's heart skipped a beat. The ship was losing power. "Damage report," he barked. "Core breach imminent." Lyra's voice trembled with alarm. "We've lost power to the starboard side. Internal systems failing." The bridge was plunged into darkness for a moment, and the crew scrambled to keep the ship stable. The hum of the engines was replaced by a low, ominous rumble as the Torrent's fury listed dangerously. "We need to disengage," Varric said, his voice strained. "Commander, we're at the breaking point. We can't survive another barrage like that." But Rylan shook his head. He had come too far. He had made the choice when he took command. There was no retreat. Not now. "Hold your positions," Rylan ordered. "We can still take them down. We fight until the very last shot." As the ship limped forward, now barely able to keep up with the enemy forces, Rylan's mind raced. He was running out of options, and the enemy was closing in fast. The Korra flagship was almost within striking distance. Another few moments, and they would be in the perfect position for a final assault. It was a 1-in-a-million chance, but it was all they had left. "Prepare to launch all remaining ordnance," Rylan said, turning toward Lyra. "Every missile, every last bit of firepower. I'm going to board that ship myself." Lyra's eyes widened. "Commander, you can't." "I can, and I will," Rylan cut her off. "This is the only chance we have to finish this. We either take down their command ship, or we all die here." Lara hesitated, then nodded. She trusted him, even if she didn't agree with the plan. Ryland could see the hesitation in her eyes, but there was no time to waste. "All hands, prepare for boarding operation," Ryland shouted, his voice echoing through the ship's comms. "I'm going after their command deck. Everyone else, hold the line." With that, Ryland turned and made his way to the launch bay. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve remained unshaken. The Trelgorians had fought for too long, for too much, to let it all end in failure. He was determined to be the one to end it. As the boarding pods were prepped, he strapped himself into the closest one, his mind focused on the task ahead. The crew had done everything they could to damage the Korra flagship, but Ryland knew it was time for the final blow. He would infiltrate their command center, disrupt their operations, and give Trelgur a chance to survive. His mission was clear. There was no turning back now. With a sharp intake of breath, Ryland braced himself as the pod launched into the void, streaking toward the heart of the Korra ship. The final battle had begun. The cold void of space stretched out before Ryland as he hurtled toward the Korra flagship. The boarding pod jolted violently as it entered the enemy ship's atmosphere, the hull vibrating as it pierced the outer defenses. The air inside the pod was thick with tension, but Ryland's focus never wavered. His pulse raced, but he shut everything out. There was only the mission, the enemy, and the need to act swiftly. His pod crashed through the flagship's lower hull with a deafening impact, the force of the collision sending sparks flying and sending him tumbling against the harness securing him. But Ryland was quick to recover, his training kicking in as he unstrapped himself and dashed for the pod's airlock. The moment the doors opened, he was greeted by the sterile alien corridors of the Korra ship, dark, jagged, and foreboding. His boots clattered against the cold metallic floors as he sprinted down the hallways, his rifle raised. He was in enemy territory now, and every second counted. The Korra forces would be scrambling, but their efficiency in battle was unmatched. They would be waiting, but Ryland was determined to reach their command deck before they could regroup. The first wave of Korra soldiers appeared, swift, lithe beings with dark exoskeletons and glowing eyes. They were a blur of motion as they emerged from side corridors, weapons raised and energy blades flashing. But Ryland was faster. He fired on instinct, his shots hitting their marks with deadly accuracy, dropping the soldiers before they could get a chance to retaliate. He pushed forward, using the cover of the ship's structural pillars to move quickly and efficiently, taking down any Korra that appeared in his path. The ship's halls were eerily silent, save for the faint hum of its engines and the occasional hiss of the alien machinery. Soon, he reached the central hub of the ship, the core of their operations. The Korra command deck. His heart pounded, but there was no time to hesitate. He reached the heavily guarded doors and dropped to the floor, taking cover behind a piece of debris. He could hear the sounds of Korra voices beyond, their alien language incomprehensible but urgent. They knew he was here. Ryland took a deep breath, calculating his next move. He had only one shot at this. With a swift movement, he tossed a stun grenade into the room. The explosion of light and sound sent shockwaves through the Korra command center, disorienting their leadership. Ryland seized the moment, charging into the room with guns blazing. He fired with precision, taking down Korra officers and soldiers in quick succession. He moved like a storm, relentless and unyielding. The Korra commander, a towering figure clad in black armor, emerged from the chaos, his eyes blazing with fury. He was unlike any enemy Ryland had faced before, his strength and speed far surpassing the soldiers he had already fought. But Ryland was undeterred. He knew that the fate of Trelgur, and perhaps the galaxy, rested on this moment. The commander charged toward him, his energy blade crackling with lethal energy. Ryland dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade as it slashed through the air, cutting through the metal walls like butter. Ryland fired off a shot at the commander, but the Korra leader blocked it effortlessly with his weapon. The force of the blow sent Ryland stumbling backward, but he regained his footing quickly, eyes locked on the enemy. The battle raged within the command center. The two warriors locked in a deadly dance of attacks and counterattacks. The Korra commander was strong, faster than Ryland could anticipate, but Ryland had something the commander didn't: the will to win. With a final, determined roar, Ryland rushed the commander, delivering a swift blow to the side, knocking the energy blade from his hand. The Korra commander staggered, stunned by the unexpected strike. Ryland seized the opportunity, his rifle aimed directly at the commander's chest. The silence that followed was deafening. "End of the line," Ryland muttered under his breath, squeezing the trigger. The blast tore through the commander's chest, and the alien crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Ryland stood over the fallen leader, breathing heavily, his body aching from the battle. He had done it. The Korra flagship was now leaderless, vulnerable. The remainder of the Korra forces would be disoriented, scrambling for a new chain of command. The invasion was over. But there was no time to savor the victory. The Korra forces outside the command room were regrouping. He could hear the distant rumble of reinforcements approaching, and the steady pulse of their ships as they readied for one last assault. Ryland grabbed the Korra commander's data pad and activated the ship's emergency override. Within moments, the command deck's weapon systems powered down, leaving the flagship vulnerable to the remaining Trelgorian forces. The reinforcements, once certain of their superiority, were now fighting an uphill battle. Ryland stepped back, his heart racing. He activated the self-destruct mechanism of the Korra flagship. A countdown initiated, echoing through the ship. "I've done my part," Ryland muttered, walking toward the airlock. The time for the final escape was now. The Torrent's fury was waiting, its crew ready to recover what they could from this war. The battle was far from over, but today they had won. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ryland allowed himself to believe that humanity might just have a chance.